Hello, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Alexandra Goho. I'm the Director of Communications at Silent Spring Institute, and I'll be moderating today's event. For those of you who are new to us, Silent Spring is a scientific research organization and a leading authority on cancer-causing chemicals in our everyday environments, with a particular focus on breast cancer prevention. If this is your first Science Cafe, welcome. Our science cafes feature conversations with experts on a variety of topics related to environmental health and are made possible thanks to generous contributions to Silent Spring Institute. Thank you to our donors for supporting these events and our science. So a few details about today's program. I'm going to spend the first 30 to 40 minutes guiding our guests in conversation, and then we'll open things up to the group so you'll all have an opportunity to ask questions. Throughout the program, please submit any questions for our guests using the Q&A feature. Another quick housekeeping note, we love hearing from you, so the chat will be open throughout the program for comments and shared insights. To keep it productive, please be respectful and mindful that this is a shared space. And again, when you have a question for our guests, please drop it in the Q&A rather than chat so we don't miss it. And then one final note, this program will be recorded and made available on our website and our YouTube channel. So with that, let's get started. Today, we're going to talk about the quest for safer products, how policies and industry practices influence our daily exposures to toxic chemicals in consumer products. You'll get a behind-the-scenes look at how advocates use science to inform decision makers, build coalitions, and advance laws that protect us all. I am delighted to introduce you to two leading experts in this space. Joining me is Lindsay Dahl. She's an environmental advocate with more than 2 decades of experience working to eliminate toxic chemicals from consumer products through policy and market shifts. She was head of mission at Beauty Counter for nearly 8 years, overseeing safety, sustainability, advocacy, and responsible sourcing. Prior to that, she was the deputy director of Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families. A seasoned strategist, Lindsay has played a leading role in the passage of over 30 laws that restrict toxic chemicals in consumer products. She is currently Chief Impact Officer at Ritual, a traceable supplement brand, and sits on the board of directors at Toxic Free Future and Chamber of Mothers. Lindsay is the author of Cleaning House, The Fight to Rid Our Homes of Toxic Chemicals, a nonfiction memoir that unpacks the science, politics, and culture behind today's clean living movement. And with Lindsay, we have Dr. Robin Dodson. She is an exposure scientist here at Silent Spring Institute, where she studies how people come into contact with chemicals in their everyday environments. She leads the Institute's exposure science program, focusing on exposures to harmful chemicals in consumer products, as well as indoor air and dust. Robin also works on developing innovative methods to measure people's exposures in community-based and epidemiological studies. And she works closely with partners to design practical interventions that help reduce harmful exposures and protect public health. Robin holds a doctorate in environmental health and a master's in environmental science and risk management from Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And she also serves as an adjunct assistant professor at Boston University School of Public Health. So welcome, both of you. It's so great to have you here today. And I'm just going to kick things off with our first question for Lindsay. Maybe we could start with just telling us a bit about how you got started in advocacy around toxic chemicals and what was the turning point in your career?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm a huge fan of Silent Spring, and just really honored to be here. So I stumbled into this work by accident. I graduated from college and was working in the environmental policy field, but really focused on renewable energy and climate change at the time. And that was what I was very passionate about. But like many roles for a junior member of the, fresh out of college, I like to say that my passion, the like length and fire of my passion was big, and the resume that I was sending to people was very short. And so I had a role that was like a 6 to 12 month paid internship, essentially working on renewable energy policy in the Midwest. And I was interviewing for a bunch of different roles, and I ended up getting a job working on a consumer safety issue, which for a 22-year-old fresh out of college, it was about baby products. And I was like, oh my gosh, snooze fest. Like this has nothing to do with the environment. I like really want to help pass laws that protect the environment. And I begrudgingly took the role because I didn't have any other work. And it ended up really being an important aha moment for me where I realized that not everyone was going to care about the world out there and kind of connect to ecosystems and air quality for places they may never visit in the same way that I was really passionate about. But what people are very passionate about is their home environment. And so it's kind of full circle of where we are today, of like really kind of focusing on the home and toxic chemicals and consumer products and what that means for our home environment. And today is a full circle moment because really we're at the time, which we can talk about, of like transitioning outside of our homes and really thinking about how these consumer choices do have very meaningful environmental impacts.
Interesting. You also talk about the sort of bridging the home environment with the external environment. Can you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, just if you think about a lot of the conversations around toxic chemicals have to do with human health and safety, which is absolutely right. There are real, um, scientific research, including many that comes from your team and organization, showing that the toxic chemicals in our products don't stay put. They actually leach into our bodies. But what people maybe don't always make the bridge to is understanding that a lot of the toxic chemical production and material production before those products get into our home have very real environmental impacts. So that's both for communities that are living next to those facilities, the drinking water, the air quality, and also end of life. So shifting from just thinking about the four walls of our home to really think about, okay, what is the entire life cycle of these different materials and what sort of people and ecosystems are being impacted at every single step of the way.
Right, great. So you were Deputy Director of Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families for a number of years. Tell us, what was the highlight of your time there, and what did you take away from that experience?
I mean, there's so many highlights. But I would say, first and foremost, working with Andy Egregious, may he rest in peace. Many of you know him. He was like one of the original, like really incredible strategists when it comes to federal policy and helping, like working as his right hand for almost 7 years was really incredible. A lot of the things that he taught me, I think I've really carried throughout my career and certainly are relevant for working on these issues today. The first of which is, really working in coalitions. So bringing together different organizations and companies to really advocate and help, create enough of pressure in Congress for us to update those federal laws. That was something that I really kind of took from those days and that work. And then second is just the power of a really strong bipartisan issue. There are so many things we can all disagree on. That was true 20 years ago. It certainly is true today. But it is very fun and very energizing to work on an issue that really does bring people together. And that was really apparent with all that policy work that we were doing in DC.
Could you give us like an example of a particular piece of legislation you worked on?
Sure. Yeah, it was a 10-year effort to help pass what were modest updates to a federal law that's called TSCA. Not the opera, if that's your thing. The Toxic Substances Control Act. It's a long name for a boring but important law that really had major flaws. It was passed in the 70s, and it's the primary law that oversees toxic chemicals long before they make it into consumer products. So really upstream, very important for that reason. And, we spent 10 years as a coalition really working in a bipartisan fashion to get some incremental and meaningful updates to our federal law, including things like, I'll just give you an example to make it real. The EPA tried to ban asbestos back in the 1990s, and they couldn't. It was thrown out by the courts because the courts said that the law basically wouldn't allow the EPA to ban asbestos because they had to show the cost to industry. That's like the simplest way to kind of boil that point down. And so, the federal courts threw out the EPA ban. And so it's like if a law can't ban asbestos, one of the most egregious, clear connections between environment and health, then what was it going to be able to do? And so removing of that cost benefit analysis provision was like one of the many incremental wins that we were able to achieve collectively. And that happened back in 2016.
So around this time, I'm going to move over to Robin now. While Lindsay was at Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, you were doing research measuring flame retardants in people's homes and documenting their exposures. Tell us a bit about how that work advanced policy.
Sure, yeah. So some people may be surprised to learn that actually Silent Spring was the first to measure these flame retardant chemicals in US homes. We started way back in Cape Cod over 25 years ago, where we detected brominated tris, which is a carcinogenic flame retardant. It is the same flame retardant that was banned from children's pajamas way back in the late 1970s, and we were finding it in people's homes more than 20 years later. It's obvious that it was being used in other ways inside the house. We followed up that work in Cape Cod, actually, with some more work in California, in the Northern California Household Exposure Study, where we found flame retardants again in people's homes. We found much higher levels of PBDEs, these polybrominated diphenyl ethers, a class of flame retardants. Much higher levels in people's dust in people's homes, but we also looked at the biomonitoring data and found much higher levels in Californians compared to the rest of the country. And this led us to really understand that, or kind of assume that this was because of California has a unique, or had a unique flammability standard on the books since the 1970s that it's basically necessitating the use of these chemicals, these flame retardant chemicals, to meet that flammability standard.
I see.
And so that flammability standard, which really is not, it doesn't say you need to use use flame retardant chemicals, but it's performance based. And the only way that the industry was able to meet that was to start adding a whole bunch of flame retardant chemicals into furniture at pretty large amounts. Like we're talking percentage levels inside of the couches. The problem is that it didn't stay put. And our research has showed that it was easily migrating out of the couches and other places where it was added in the homes, and it was eventually ending up in the dust and eventually ending up in people. And that was a really big concern. So we started doing some more work, trying to really disentangle, trying to understand the impact of these flammability standards. And one way that we tried to do that was actually in our healthy, what we had at the time was called a Healthy Green Campus program. This is where we were working with higher ed to think about how institutional decisions, purchasing specifications could have an impact on exposures on college campuses. And we decided to focus on flame retardant chemicals. And so what we did is we collected a whole bunch of samples, both in dorm rooms and in classrooms on different campuses that were adhering to different flammability standards. And we were able to show that there was a difference in the concentrations of these chemicals inside of these indoor spaces because of the flammability standards. Now, at the same time as we were doing this research on exposure, there was a lot of research going on the efficacy of these flammability standards. And we're finding that, in fact, the flammability standards as they were written resulted in no increased fire safety benefit. So here we had a flammability standard that was on the book with no fire safety benefit. But the result was that we were dumping a whole bunch of chemicals into our indoor spaces, these flame retardant chemicals. So,
And Robin, when you say no safety benefit, you mean like it was not saving lives, basically.
exactly. Yeah. So if you were to compare places that didn't have these flammability standards versus those that did, it was showing that as the law was written, as the flammability standard was written, in fact, that there was no actually increased benefit for the more severe standard that was requiring the use of these flame retardant chemicals. And so we realized that that's where we should focus. And shout out to former research scientist or former scientist at Silent Spring, Catherine Rogers, who spent a lot of time digging into flammability standards. She had a lot of conversations locally, so in Boston and Massachusetts, also with the Consumer Product Safety Commission, to try to help revise these standards because we were seeing their influence on exposures. And the really great news is that these flammability standards have since been revised because of our research and others, research from others. And so now you are able to buy furniture without added flame retardants. And so this is a really exciting win, really, I think, from thinking about protecting our health, in that we started off asking questions just generally about the exposures and then tried to pinpoint it to try to really understand what is driving these exposures. And we're able to demonstrate with our science that it was the flammability standards. And so now today, the standards have been revised in California and also now federally. You can buy furniture without these added flame retardant chemicals. You do have to look, you have to ask, but they are readily available. And that was really because we were trying to combine some of our science with these kind of really important kind of policy questions around why were these chemicals being used in our homes.
And when you say you have to look, meaning you have to look on the label on the furniture for a
Yeah,
specific.
exactly. So
Yeah.
if you look at that label on the back, it should say, you should have a little check mark right next to the no added flame retardant chemicals. You can also ask. I think that's really important that consumers also kind of voice and ask questions about what chemicals might actually be in their products.
Interesting. So how did that experience shape how you approach future research projects? What lessons did you learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is that it really reinforced the importance of trying to think about working at multiple levels, right, to address toxic chemical exposure. So, yes, there's a lot we can do at the individual level with what we choose to purchase. We need to work at the institutional level, like we were working at with higher ed, to think about purchasing specifications or kind of institutional-wide policies. And of course, then even further up into the state level, in this case with the flammability standards and working to support California to revise their flammability standards. So really a kind of a multi-prong or multi-level approach is really necessary when we're trying to tackle some of these issues. It's also really important to think about the research question that you're asking. And how you can design a rigorous scientific study to answer a particular question that would actually have most policy relevance or policy impact. And that can be tricky, but it's really important because generating that evidence is going to be really important for changing the policies or actually introducing any policies. And so I think we've kind of started to think about this on kind of multiple levels, right? So there's the policy decisions. It's also thinking about, are there intervention strategies, both at the consumer level or even higher up into the institutional level, where we can start asking some questions about what are the most effective ways to try to reduce our exposures to these chemicals. And so I think it's a multi-pronged approach is necessary. I think one real example that actually kind of came to light more recently is a study that we published earlier. I shouldn't say this year, actually last year, and the flame retardant, the formaldehyde releasers in personal care products. Formaldehyde releasers are chemicals that are intentionally added to products to release formaldehyde, which is a known human carcinogen. And the problem is they've got these long, complicated names that do not exactly roll off the tongue. So like DMDM, hydantin, or diazolydinyl urea. And the problem is that we shouldn't expect people to go to the store with a magnifying glass and these long, complicated names. That is not going to be the approach that is going to be most effective. Rather, we need state policies or federal policies that are actually going to help people so they do not have to make those difficult decisions in the store. And luckily, we have an example of that right now. Washington State has actually done a tremendous amount of work trying to think about and limit the use of these formaldehyde releasers in personal care products.
And they were, I think, the first, it sounds like, right?
Exactly. They were one of the first and most extensive, most broadly, actually limiting 25 different formaldehyde releasers in products.
Wow. Wow. Great. So I'm going to move back over to Lindsay for a second. So Lindsay, after years of doing advocacy for nonprofits, you moved to the corporate world. So you took a job at Beauty Counter where you worked to reform our federal cosmetic safety laws. I'd love to hear you talk about that experience and how it compared with your earlier work at Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families.
Sure. I was hesitant to take the leap to the corporate side because I had spent a decade working in the NGO community and I liked the independence of it. And what I mean by that is I liked the kind of simplicity of my job is to take this amazing science that Robin just talked about, help translate it to the market to get consumers to push companies, and also use it as a very powerful tool when lobbying state and federal governments. And so I was reluctant to go to the corporate side of things. The company at the time was only a year old, and I, was young and child free, so could make a move from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles. I ultimately said yes. And I was really doing it to test the hypothesis of can these same tools that are, tried and true grassroots organizing tools from the NGO community, can it be translated to a corporate environment in an authentic way?
Mhm.
And so I spent nearly 8 years at the business. My scope and role evolved over time, but ultimately was in charge of both overseeing and implementing the safety and testing programs, in addition to other things like packaging, also a safety issue,
Mhm.
responsible sourcing, et cetera. But also so like operationalizing a lot of the things that I had been lobbying for years. And turns out that it was a lot harder to make safer products than I had maybe anticipated, even for a brand and working for a CEO that really cared about it and wanted to do the right thing. The ecosystem in the corporate environment there at Beauty Counter was such that I had more buy-in than I would in nearly any other position. But still, making products safely was really hard. And there's a couple different reasons for that. We can get into it if it's interesting. But also, then how do you take the same toolbook on the policy side of things and do nonpartisan advocacy that I had been, again, from a business perspective? And corporate activism is kind of cool now. There's lots of like CEOs taking selfies on Capitol Hill as like a marketing moment. But at the time, it was very scary. People were like, don't get into that. It's too political. And I had to, just be like, no, I'm talking about like individuals on social media or whatever. And it ended up being one of the most powerful things we did as a business. In over the course of 8 years, we helped pass 16 different laws, including updates to our federal law. It's called MOCRA now, but federal cosmetic safety laws that hadn't been updated since the 1930s. And a lot of that was consistently using the power of the consumer base to really weigh in at the state and federal level in a very consistent way. And again, the power of grassroots, whether it's from a company mobilizing people or from a nonprofit, it again just really showed the strength of the science behind this issue, how strong the bipartisan backing there was, and again, there's still a lot of work to be done to make cosmetics safer. But a lot of leadership at the state and federal level has at least moved the needle in really meaningful ways, and it was helpful to have a business voice in the room that was unapologetically advocating for the same things that the public health community was as well.
Maybe tell us a bit more how your message was received on by yeah different legislators, like versus say at Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families. Like, what was did they sort of receive you differently or receive them? Were they more open to the message?
Yeah, absolutely, which is a bummer to say, but I know from the Safer Chemicals days when we would bring a business member into the room, like money talks, and it's not because all these corporations are automatically donating to elected officials. A lot of people go there. Yes, of course, there's an issue with corporate donations. However, people really listen to businesses because whether you're manufacturing across the United States, which we were, employing people, which is really meaningful. Also, there's just more credibility in when I would argue, for example, kind of like unpacking some of the red herring arguments that the chemical industry was saying. I'd be like, that's actually not true. I'm going to tell you why. It's because I was there formulating products. Like I was helping get a lipstick to market with, the least amount of contamination of heavy metals as possible. And like just getting into the specifics, I think were really helpful from a lobbying perspective, because we could kind of cut through some of the noise.
Right. Um, is at this time too, one of the connections you have with Robin is that Beauty Counter invited Robin to attend a congressional briefing related to cosmetic safety. Maybe Robin, tell us a bit about what you wanted that audience to know.
Yeah, sure. That was actually the first time I met Lindsay in person, although of course knew of her work. And we had just at that time, Silent Spring had just published a study showing endocrine disrupting chemicals in hair products used by Black women, which was really kind of the beginning of our continued work in the beauty justice space. And so I understood my role to go to the Hill was to share my science, share my expertise, and to be in that role as a scientist. But really, the importance of partnerships with advocates, activists, others who are working on the policy side. And really kind of supporting that partnership. So I really saw my role to just share what I knew, share what the science was telling us, share what the peer-reviewed literature was telling us about exposure to chemicals from personal care products, and then let the others kind of take that message and really use it to support more effective policies like MOCRA and others.
Yeah, so maybe what were the things that you wanted to know specifically about the research? Like what were you learning at the time about these chemicals?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, we kind of had knew a bit about this, but we certainly, our product testing work, like that of our hair testing work, was really demonstrating the fact that these endocrine disrupting chemicals were ubiquitous in products that people were using. In the hair products that are being marketed and used by Black women in particular, the levels tend to be a bit higher. So this is starting to kind of unravel and try to understand our current work, trying to look at why are there exposure disparities among women of color, why are there health disparities among women of color, and so I think really kind of digging in and trying to think about some of those questions about where are these chemicals coming from, how are we being exposed to them, and what are the downstream effects, like the exposure and the health disparities that we're seeing, are really important. And are there, again, certain policies that could be put into place to try to help us understand and stop that inequalities and exposures that we were observing?
One of the things, if I can jump in, that was so powerful of the forum of a congressional briefing. If you're not a policy nerd, it's basically think about how many offices you can meet within a particular day. So if you're lucky and you're like moving really fast, you could do 8 or 9 offices. And the power of this is that we had a room with 50 different congressional staff. And so every single member of Congress, whether it's on the House or Senate side, they have experts that they hire to be kind of their eyes and ears on all of these issues, because there's no way a member of Congress can know everything about all the bills that they are asked to vote on. And so we really targeted the people that were sitting on committees and the staff that were there to really understand. And so the power of Robin being able to share this science to an audience of, 50 staffers, it builds on their base knowledge that ultimately helps them give a recommendation to their boss of, hey, I think you should vote for this bill, or I think you should vote against it, and here's why. You're really starting to like fill out the context. And that type of venue, especially when you can have like a presentation with visuals and stuff like that, is just really high impact in a way that a one-on-one lobbying meeting, maybe you can't always get that much information conveyed in that amount of time.
Interesting. Wow, that's great. Now, Lindsay, I want to move over and talk about your book. So you recently published a book called Cleaning House. Tell us a bit about the book and why you decided to write it.
Yeah, I like to joke, I don't tell anyone to clean their house. It's a metaphor for a lot of different things, but I wrote the book because during COVID, at the time I was at Beauty Counter and I saw the seeds of what I now call wellness wars or clean wars on social media. And really, I was tagged every single day in comments and different social media posts of like, hey, this person's saying that formaldehyde releasers aren't an issue, and the exposure to flame retardants in our home is negligible, and it actually doesn't matter. Will you please respond? And so people kept tagging me in all this content. I was like, I'm not going to engage on these posts because it just means that more people will see this misinformation. And this is a really complicated issue. The answer is always, it depends. Like if someone's asking, is something toxic? Is it safe? Is it what? Like there's so much nuance when you look at the field of environmental health science. And I really felt like in order to do it justice, I had to go analog, and writing a book was the best way to do that. I also wrote the book because I didn't feel like anyone had told the story. There's really good books about the science of environmental health policy, but no one had put science, policy, and culture together. And the cultural element is what I really saw and was experiencing, where suddenly it was like our whole worlds were being shaped by social media algorithms, including content that's like takedown content of like, oh, this person's just fear mongering, or it's just like everything has a side now. And I saw how environmental health and this work could really get caught in the crosshairs, and it certainly has. And so I wanted to be able to write a book that had the appeal of the masses, but still didn't shortchange the kind of nuance of how all these things fit together. And the best way to do that is to tell stories, because that's the thing I know as a lobbyist is that people don't remember facts, but they do remember stories. And so I tell each chapter through the story of highlighting a different person. So one chapter is called the scientist, the lawyer, the CEO, the politician. And I really wanted to elevate the voices of a lot of people that are not household names, but probably should be, those working on different areas of this issue. And I certainly feature the science from Silent Spring Institute. And I really wanted to have heavy citations in the back for people to be able to see the richness and foundation of peer-reviewed science that this topic is built on, that it's not just some social media wellness fad, that there is a real issue here, as you well know from the legacy of people like Rachel Carson. And so I wanted to be able to kind of package it together in a way that was, again, giving credit to the complexity and nuance of this, but still felt like a fast-paced read that hopefully makes people chuckle from time to time.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of stories, I'd love if you could sort of share a particular story with us about, for instance, you talk about the importance of having stories to share with members of Congress. Like that was a really important tool to be able to impart how important this work is. Was there a particular story that you shared with a member of Congress that really made a difference?
Sure. I'll start. I'll actually start before like my early days in Minnesota, where I was helping do policy at the state level. This was when these topics were not top of mind. There was no press, certainly like I would say the public awareness of issues like this were basically lead and household paint. And that was kind of it. So with that as a context, going in as a young lobbyist, talking about polybrominated diphenyl ethers, toxic flame retardants that are in our couches, I mean, people would immediately glaze over. So I learned kind of early on to tell the story of how did flame retardants end up in couches in the first place. And I tell the story in my book, but it's basically a love affair between the tobacco industry and the chemical industry, and it started back in the 70s. And like instantly, that sounds more interesting than me opening up a lobbying pitch saying, so I'm here to talk about polybrominated diphenyl ether. So I think that is just like a little snippet of getting to the why. Why should we care? Why is this an issue? But using the power of storytelling. The other thing is the storytelling of science. So, I helped pass the first ban on BPA in baby bottles and sippy cups in 2009 in the state of Minnesota. And again, we talked about the story of how science is, research is set up to look for high or low dose exposures, and how that was really relevant for our understanding of endocrine disruptors at the time, which was still not new, but newer as far as the science goes compared to today. And I would use the visual storytelling when testifying of like holding up two baby bottles, one that I knew that was polyethylene and one that was BPA. And I would ask people, do you know which one has a hormone disrupting chemical in it? And the answer, of course, was no. It was rhetorical. It was just to kind of help convey the consumer experience of people aren't going to know what's on shelf. And guess what? If you're a new mom, the last thing you need to worry about or have on your to-do list is carrying complex, chemical names to a store with you. Like this is ridiculous that we would put a burden on parents' shoulders. And so again, these are just little examples of how stories are really powerful to help, especially elected officials realize the experience that their constituents were having and how in many cases that's unjust in many different ways. To put this burden again on consumer shoulders rather than banning these toxic chemicals outright.
Um, Coming back to something else you talk about in your book, you talk about the two extremes, the perfectionists and the dismissers, who've become very influential on social media, and maybe have muddied the waters a bit. Maybe first, just tell us, what is a perfectionist and what is a dismisser? And then second, you talk about trying to build a pragmatic base in the middle. How are you going to do that?
Okay, so these are crude simplifications, so stay with me. Um, but I really, yeah, I started to see these kind of factions on social media. And again, it's designed by algorithms to promote kind of the more kind of egregious or salacious content gets promoted and more I see it, right? So like again, I wrote a book about toxic chemicals and I spent a lot of time talking about how toxic social media is. But really, like on one hand, you've got the perfectionists, and the perfectionists, I like to say, are some people that like are well intended but get really fired up about this issue. They hit social media. So maybe there's unintentional or intentional kind of like shame that comes across. So like people receiving the information feel like they're being judged for the purchases they make, or they're trying to control their way to safety. So, like getting super zeroed in on every single thing in their house and becoming really obsessive with this topic. I see the kind of diet culture playbook can be translated very easily into this issue. And I think the perfectionists sometimes have an aspiration of trying to shop your way to safety that it doesn't actually line up with the science because we know that we're exposed in a lot of different ways. Then on the other hand, you have the dismissers, and these are individuals that kind of come from a variety of different backgrounds. Cosmetic chemists are very vocal. They're experts in the how different ingredients mix together to make different types of cosmetics, but they're not experts in chemical safety. So the title is a little misleading. Or even some like public health or nutritionists that you would think could be strong champions of environmental health, but basically they've got all this fodder from the perfectionists, overstating the science. We know it's easy to do, and just like using these as ways to create this kind of take down social media content. Now, if this isn't on your radar at all, this is like a really big, important cultural element that does impact our ability to help push the market and help push policies. So I thought it was important to kind of show the reader how these different kind of personas on social media are actually potentially hindering, if we let them, real progress. And so what I do is I call people to join the pragmatists, which really is leading into the nuance of the science that I mentioned before, understanding that we can't control our way to safety, but it's still okay to shop for products. And if you have the ability or the income to be able to prioritize those purchases, not making people feel bad about that, and simultaneously pushing back on some of these dismissed or talking points, which I've heard directly from the chemical industry for years. And just kind of shedding a little bit of light to people that our understanding of the science and the fundamental original foundations of traditional toxicology don't apply to the ways in which we know chemicals often behave. And getting people to kind of understand that, I think, is what I'm trying to do. So to answer your question of how do you get people to join the pragmatists, I think getting people to follow organizations like the Silent Spring Institute on social media instead of wellness influencers. So one of the big things that I really want people to do to get their information from nonprofit leaders that have scientists on staff like yourself, Robin, to help properly translate this in a way that is factual and doesn't overstate the science. I think that's one of the best ways and one of the most powerful tools we can have is to really invest in and spend our time and energy getting information from organizations like the Silent Spring Institute.
Um, I'm going to move back to Robin now. Robin, so, Silent Spring has done a lot of work engaging communities and learning about their personal exposures to toxic chemicals so people can make informed decisions about their health. Wondering how do you see that work being applied to the broader public?
Yeah, sure. So, we have spent years, our former executive director, Julie Brody, has spent years developing this whole area of research in health communication, science communication, known as report back. So that's one example in ways that we try to share our information, our science back with the public, including study participants. And so that area is trying to understand how to effectively share environmental health data and results with study participants. And what's great is that we have shown that this sharing of environmental health information and results with study participants has really been able to increase what we call environmental health literacy. That is kind of the capacity at which people are able to make informed decisions about their exposures that may affect their health. And so we've had a lot of experience in that space. More recently, we started another project, actually co-led with my colleague, Dr. Alicia Franklin, called the Power Project, where we actually saw this opportunity in social media and social media influencers to actually try to combat misinformation that we were seeing. And so what we did is we engaged directly with social media influencers. We talk about, we first kind of give them the background information they need on the science. In this case, we're very much focused on endocrine disrupting chemicals and exposures, particularly among Black women. And so educating social media influencers and then asking that they get the message out there in their own voice and in their own creative way. Of course, they are the experts in that. All of them, their content that they were sharing was reviewed by us as scientists to make sure that it was accurate, but it was in their own voice, and that could have the biggest impact. So we were trying to combat basically the misinformation using the same tools where people were kind of just perpetuating that misinformation with that Power Project. So that's just one example or another example of how we are trying to think about creative ways to communicate our science so that people, it reaches the people who need it the most.
Great. So now I'm going to ask a question that I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds. Right now, we're seeing rollbacks of regulations at the federal level. How can we create a pathway to ensure independent science continues to inform and strengthen consumer protections and support safer products? And this is a question for both of you. So I don't know, Lindsay, if you want to take a crack at it first.
Sure. I think, yes, a lot of the progress that we've made over the last several decades is currently being rolled back, or is the threats of it are happening. If there's one thing that I've learned as my time as a lobbyist, people are like, oh, aren't you so jaded? Like, you've been doing this for so long. It's so depressing. The longer I do this, actually, the more hopeful I become. And that's not a statement that I say lightly. I say that genuinely because there are so many wins that have happened because of people that made individual phone calls to their elected officials at the state and federal level. The amount of industry influence is tremendous, and we have consistently been able to beat the chemical industry and their trade associations through the power of grassroots action. So in this moment in time, I think one of the best tools we have is our ability to pick up the phone or leave a note on the contact form of your elected official's website, which is the most important, like highly effective way to directly get that email to those staffers that I mentioned previously. But I think we have the ability to create enough noise that regardless of who's in office, they're scared and realize that this is like a very important political issue for a lot of people, especially for swing voters, which a bunch of polling helps confirm that. The other thing is that it's also really important for us to make sure that our elected officials, especially for those that are on the campaign trail, it is an election year, regardless of who you vote for, asking questions during this critical time means they're going to listen to you more because they're trying to earn our votes to get back into office. And part of that conversation should be restoring and maintaining funding for a lot of the critical science that is required in order for us to understand the impacts of these toxic chemicals, because there is no lobbying and there is no market pressure without the foundations of science. And so that has to be an equally important part of our message as constituents to our elected officials.
Right.
Yeah, I really do think that the science is really key there. I mean, I'm not saying that as a scientist, but I think that it also thinking about different partnerships at different levels. Right now, I'm seeing maybe more kind of the local and the state levels might be the most effective right now in terms of some of these policies related to chemical exposures. I think there's a lot of action, for example, on some of these personal care product bills that are happening in various states, either have recently passed or are kind of up. And so I think there's a lot of work that people can do kind of more at the local level, and to support independent science. So this is really critical. And Lindsay, you touch on it in your book, and I'm so appreciative of its ideas that we need to support independent science outside of the area of conflict of interest that industries or others might have, and to do rigorous science, and to ask those scientific questions, rely on the scientific method, so that we can then support these policies that we need. And really, it's also not only supporting kind of the policies moving forward, but also really supporting the policies that are in place right now to kind of combat or push back against any potential rollbacks. I mean, we saw it with the flame retardants for chemicals, is that we just needed to keep creating that evidence, and that evidence, was going to be really important to try to push things forward, but also to make sure things kept moving in the forward direction and never in the backwards direction. And I think that's really, really key, is that we just keep asking those questions that have policy relevance and then conducting rigorous science to back them up.
I would add to, like, I think you have a great, the finer point you put, Robin, on like states are moving and can be able to push things forward, while our phone calls to our federal government are about stopping any sort of rollbacks from the existing progress that we do have. Saferstates.org, if you're not familiar, is a great place. Their state policy tracker is a really helpful tool to be able to look to see what's happening in your state and then connect you to especially the local nonprofits that are working on the ground there to help advance some of those laws.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, going to that site, yeah, if people want sort of like to feel good about like the progress, we actually have made a lot of progress. You'll be surprised at how many bills have been passed across the country in different states. So if you're looking to sort of a feel good moment, it's a great site to check out. Okay, well, I think we are, I want to make sure we have time to open up the discussion to our audience. This has been a terrific conversation so far. I invite guests to ask questions by placing them in the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll do our best to answer as many as we can. We also have some questions that were submitted in advance, and so I'm going to be asking a mix of both. So I guess the first question I'd like to ask is, somebody asked, what do you consider the highest priority products or chemicals for state regulators to address today? And this can be for both of you.
Sure.
Robin,
I mean,
do
I
you want
could.
to start?
Sure. Yeah. This is also just because I've kind of just been releasing this study in the last 6 months or so, but I really think that certain chemicals in consumer products, particularly in personal care products like formaldehyde releasers, are super important. Formaldehyde is a known carcinogen, and I don't want that in my products. And I think that really to address that issue, we need a policy solution rather than a consumer solution. And so I really think that is a high priority right now, is thinking about those particular ingredients that might be in certain personal care products, for which there are alternatives. There are safer alternatives than formaldehyde releasers in terms of other preservatives that could be used. And so thinking about what are those chemicals, those ingredients that might be kind of hiding behind some vagueness, some kind of obscureness about their presence in products, and really bring those to light and regulate those particular products, or those particular ingredients in personal care products. So formaldehyde releasers, and then there's some others, even things like PFAS. Again, those are hard to kind of see on product labels. So any of those chemicals that are kind of hiding in plain sight really should be those targets.
And I would add that if you look at the kind of highest hazard, persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic PBTs as a class of chemicals, that's where I would really focus. Like if I were a state regulator and had the authority to be able to target those really high hazard. So think about like, PFAS forever chemicals, yes, a problem in makeup, but even much larger applications that are used across different products within our homes, including, treatments for couches that our children are crawling on, to makes stains easier to carpet, like really large household exposures that are not only really meaningful when you think about the toxicity and persistence for those particular chemicals. Flame retardants is something else that would fall like PFAS in that PBT category, but also just really long exposure because they don't, break down, and what that means for workers and these kind of global pollutants that are going to really stick around for a long time. That's kind of where I would hone in if I was in a position like that.
Great, thanks. We have a question here. When we find ingredients in our products that are known to be dangerous, how should we dispose of them?
That's a good question. Lindsay, I wonder, if you've approached that when you were at Beauty Counter, if you had questions about that.
Um, yeah, I mean the best answer is it kind of depends, especially if you're thinking of like a smaller like a beauty product or something like that. Putting it unfortunately in the trash is likely the best way unless you want to get rid of the product on the inside and then send the packaging to a take back program like the Pack Collective. But it's really challenging when you think about some of these bigger products. So like a good example, this is some of the unseen stuff that people don't think about. So I had to replace the carpet in my basement recently, and my husband and I had to spend a lot of time making sure we didn't have recycled foam padding. It sounds like it's a good thing. You think you're going to do something right by the environment. But really, what happens is that when polyurethane foam that has been treated with toxic flame retardants, like from couches, is then broken down and recycled into this foam, you're reintroducing it back into your home environment. So that's a good example of where, unfortunately, some of these larger items, whether it's mattresses or certain building materials and couches, landfilling them, unfortunately, is some of the best option, even though that's not perfect. So there's no real great solution. What it does put is more urgency on the pressure for us to fix these problems upstream, because again, the legacy of all these products is really long term, especially when we're looking at some of those more persistent classes of chemicals.
Here we have a question. What should we be avoiding with infants, especially from a grandparent's point of view, to help our grandkids with our discretionary income? So what should grandparents do who are looking after their grandkids?
So a lot of my more recent research now has been focusing on the home environment and thinking about childhood exposures in the home environment. I think there are ways, of course, buying some of these kind of safer products, of course, is super important. But I also think helping families, young families who've got a lot going on, helping them also things of but seemingly very simple approaches, things like more effective cleaning inside people's homes. So using like a high quality vacuum with a HEPA filter. It's amazing how far that can go, especially those chemicals that tend to stick around. And we know that small children love to play on the floor. They're more highly exposed to chemicals that end up in dust. And so keeping dust levels low. We're not going to like shop our way out of it. It's more of like providing the resources or whatever it is to help people be more effectively trying to mitigate the exposures that are already likely in their house. And then, of course, being mindful consumers. As Lindsay brought up too, right? This idea is that think about those that have the biggest exposure potential, things related to things like furniture, paints. PFAS, unfortunately, are now finding their way into paints. And so that could be a particular source. So being a more mindful consumer on things that you might bring into the house, but then also thinking about what are these simple, effective strategies for trying to reduce exposures once these chemicals are inside our house.
I have a couple tips to add to that. The first of which is, especially since the way the question was phrased was like, if there's more discretionary income, think about the like more expensive, bigger ticket items, especially when someone is expecting. Like a baby mattress is really important. If you look for things like the Made Safe certification, there's like different certifications that can help signal that a product is safer, but especially some of those are still much more expensive. And so, car seats, another good example where it's like investing in a car seat without flame retardants and PFAS costs more. So, offering to pay for some of those. Or if someone's redoing the nursery, like Robin said, really being mindful. My mom actually purchased a really nice HEPA vacuum for us when I had my first 8 years ago. And again, knowing what I knew about the science, it was like that was a pricey item, but actually has been a really like meaningful workhorse in helping reduce our exposure.
That's great. Excellent. Um, Here's a question from somebody. I follow the Mass Environmental Justice Council public meetings for the Social and Environmental Action Committee at my church. How do we communicate the threats from toxic chemicals to EJ populations? Maybe in places where there's, lower English fluency, for instance.
I can start. There's a lot of really incredible organizations that are working on environmental justice specific to toxic chemicals. And so, first and foremost, a lot of them are locally based but have a national presence. And I know Silent Spring, you collaborate with a lot of these important EJ groups. So I'll let you speak to that. But again, tapping into and then financially supporting if you're able, some of these local EJ organizations helps because they have the infrastructure and connection to the community in place. Those organizations and donations also help do things like translate a lot of these educational materials in multiple different languages. Also important if you think about some of the work that's happening to help educate salon workers. You need translated materials often to help make sure that people have the right information to either raise their voices within their local government or communities or make decisions within their home to help find safer products.
Yeah, 100%. I think that there's some really great organizations that are working in these spaces. I also think it's really important to listen to the community members themselves, invite them to the table, listen to their experiences, and really have the community members themselves be a part of anything or any action. Is it the research that needs to be conducted? Is it the advocacy that needs to happen? But those community voices, let the community speak for themselves in this space is really, really important. And in any way that you could lift that up and support those voices.
Great. We have time for just one quick question that I wanted to get in here. Maybe you could talk about some products are labeled green or sustainable, for instance, like fabrics, it may not be really green or sustainable. How are people supposed to know, navigate some of the labeling?
Yeah, I mean, I know, Lindsay, you have a lot of experience with this. I mean, from an exposure science perspective, I think there's a lot of greenwashing. It's really confusing. And unfortunately, there's little guidance. Although I would say that I think you've brought up some certification programs. I think certification programs can help in this space. Where they are bringing their expertise to help you basically evaluate, so you are not overwhelmed with all those, natural, safe, green kind of marketing coming at you. So having kind of a third party actually evaluate the product or evaluate the purchasing decision can be really effective. So look for those made safe. EPA's programs on safer choice and things like that can be really effective.
Yep.
Yeah.
I also think it's important for people to ask if you have time, hard questions to the companies that you purchase from. So what I see, greenwashing happens both like in an intentional kind of malicious, I'm going to steal market share for people that care about this and jack up the price of something. But oftentimes for a lot of newer companies, comes from naivete. And there's a lot of really cool businesses that are built on this like clean and sustainable ethos that were founded by founders that really care and feel passionate, but they haven't hired anyone to actually implement these programs. And so as someone that has been on the corporate side for now 12 plus years, I can't tell you how many people, founders call me and they're like, oh, this is cool what you did within supplements or within beauty or whatever. And like, great. Do you have any scientists on staff? And they're like, nope. So what I'm getting at is asking hard questions of, hey, how do you choose which ingredients are safe? What kind of product testing do you have? Even if you can't decipher what the response is, asking those questions helps put pressure on companies to realize that they can't just be making the marketing claims. They actually need to hire and build programs internally in order to bring safer products to the market. I think it's one of the most powerful tools. I'm the one at Ritual who's responding to a lot of those questions. So I know how that kind of information and those questions can also be used internally to help me make the case for new programming that I want to invest in as well.
Great. Okay, well, I see we're almost at the hour, so I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. But thank you so much, Lindsay and Robin, and all of you. This has been a terrific discussion. If you haven't already, please pick up a copy of Lindsay's new book, Cleaning House, available online through HarperCollins and other booksellers. It's a fantastic story with lots of actionable information. We will be emailing you a link to the recording when it's available, so keep an eye out for that, along with some additional resources. You'll receive a short survey about today's program, and we appreciate your feedback. And as a thank you, one survey respondent will be randomly selected to receive a signed copy of Lindsay's book. If you'd like to learn more about Silent Spring Science, please visit our website at silentspring.org and be sure to sign up for our newsletter. Silent Spring also has an app called Detox Me with a library of practical tips for avoiding toxic chemicals in your everyday life. And finally, you can help keep this work going by becoming a Silent Spring sustainer with a monthly gift. Every contribution makes a difference, allowing us to create the science needed to protect people from harmful chemicals and make the world safer. So please be as generous as you can. We are very grateful for your year-round support. So once again, thank you to our guests, Lindsay and Robin, and to all of you for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.